He wrote a book in 2011 called Death by China. I mean, I have that front and center on my bookshelf. It's a great book. You got to read it. You get it at Amazon or anything else. Death by China. Peter Navarro. He'll lay the whole thing out. And he is joining us now live from the White House. Peter Navarro, Senior Economic Policy Advisor to the President and Assistant to the President for Trade and Manufacturing. Peter, you're my hero. It's great to have you on, man.
I appreciate the praise, my friend, but you're doing the work out there, getting the message out. And the message this week was basically a great deal, not just for America, but North America. The president is just an amazing guy because he actually keeps the promises that he makes. What a concept for a politician. And he promised back in June of 2016 he would renegotiate that NAFTA deal. NAFTA is now dead. We now have the US-Mexico-Canada agreement, and it's great news for workers in manufacturing industries as well as farmers and innovators. And we can go through some of the elements of it if you want, but
yes,
top line is great week for America.
Let me start with I want to get to the elements, and as you know, you know this well because we've talked many times. I've hated NAFTA from day one. I was one of the only Republicans railing in opposition to it when it first came out, and I always said that Ross Perot, at the end of the day, he was quirky, but he had that sucking sound. He had that nailed, and that's exactly what happened. So I never thought I would see the day where it would go, and so to me, Sunday night was like Christmas. But I was at the UN on Wednesday. All right, so I just want you to spend 2 minutes on this, and then we can get to the specifics of the deal. I was in New York on Wednesday. I was at the president's live press conference. And it was fascinating because somebody asked him about his negotiations there with Canada, and one of the questions was Prime Minister Trudeau asked for a meeting. You turned it down. Is that true? And he said, absolutely. And then he said, not only did I turn the meeting down, I've instructed my trade team to stop negotiating with Canada. They're not negotiating in good faith. I don't appreciate how they're going about this. They don't understand the stakes here. And so I've told them we're going to go with Mexico, and maybe they'll come back to the table some other time. But I said, stop negotiating with them. We're done. That was Wednesday. Sunday night, you get a deal. What happened?
Well, 99% of the deal was done based on the framework laid down with the Mexico deal. Remember, some weeks ago, we entered into a bilateral with Mexico, and that hit all the high notes. I mean, it hit, for example, in the manufacturing space, strong domestic content in the cars we build, right? It hit market access for agricultural products. It hit the notes for protecting digital trade and so-called biologics, which are pharmaceuticals at the modern end of the spectrum. We were just a little apart on a couple of things like dairy and some dispute resolution mechanisms. And I said this on the air, on TV and radio. I was puzzled why it was taking us so long to get to an agreement that really benefited all three countries. So, I mean, at the end of the day, liken this to a boxing match where a lot of punches get thrown, but the match is over now, and all three parties raise up their hands in triumph. And unlike that thing, that abomination that they signed in 1994 for NAFTA, this is actually good for America. What a concept.
I know, right? We're with Peter Navarro.
It is. I mean, it is. I'm telling you, you know this better than I. I mean, NAFTA was a bad deal for America. China getting into the WTO in 2001, which was pushed by Clinton and Congress, bad deal for America. 2012 South Korean deal. I mean, we lost over 100,000 jobs primarily in the auto industry. Bad deal for America. I mean, the president's just lining these things up like pins in a bowling alley and knocking them down, and it's a beautiful thing to watch.
It really is. We're with Peter Navarro. He's assistant to the president for trade and manufacturing in the West Wing. He's also a senior economic policy advisor. Peter Navarro, let's get to some of the key items in this new deal the USMCA, U.S., Mexico, Canada, some of the differences, some of the changes. If you could go through some of the bigger ones, that would be great.
Sure. Let's start with the easy stuff, which is the modernization of the agreement. Back in 1994, there were some things that didn't exist and therefore didn't need provisions. One of them, obviously, is digital trade, which is the protection of copyright for intellectual property that's transferred over the net, something as simple as an electronic book you might buy and read. Right. So we have strong provisions for that. There's these things called biologics, which is a reference to complicated pharmaceuticals that are very research intensive, that are designed over time to cure things like cancer or rheumatoid arthritis or whatever. And we got strong protections for that up to 10 years. Why is that important? Is because unless companies have protection so that they can make some money on these things over a period of time, they won't put in the money for the research and development. So that's all good. So innovators are taken care of. Digital trade is taken care of. Now, another small but important thing relative to the scope of the whole deal, we were able to resolve some of the dairy issues with Canada, and so that's good news. We'll have much more market access there, as well as for other types of products like chicken and eggs, things like that. So that's good. For me, as the director of the Office of Trade Manufacturing Policy, the big white whale here that we actually got was bringing back the supply chain to North America, particularly for the auto industry. What NAFTA did in 1994 is create a set of incentives to offshore our auto parts industry and turn our vertically integrated manufacturing auto plants into assembly plants for foreign parts. Mm-hmm. And that didn't just happen here in the U.S., it happened in Canada and Mexico as well. Mm-hmm. And so the key provision is 75% of any car that's made has to have a U.S. part 75%. And then to ensure that the U.S. gets its fair share of that regional content, there's a strong provision for labor in there, strong provision for the environment, so you can't have sweatshops and pollution havens south of our border grabbing that business. So that's going to dramatically change the structure and supply chain of the global auto industry in a way where we, as the largest purchaser of vehicles per capita, will benefit from that. So that's the big deal. It's great news for this country.
And Peter Navarro, are there also safeguards that would discourage China, for instance, from dumping goods into Canada and then bringing them into the U.S. by a third party, which they've been doing forever?
That's a great and astute question. Yeah, yes, there are. With enhanced border review and things like that, but there's also a couple of provisions in there which are going to be part of any agreement that we sign that are directly aimed at the unfair trade practices of China. For example, there's, in the jargon they call disciplines, there's disciplines on state-owned enterprises being able to enter the zone. And China is kind of the leading purveyor of state-owned enterprises that engage in unfair trade practices. There's also a provision in there for currency manipulation. And again, there's a lot of countries out there that purposely undervalue their currency as a way of boosting their exports, discouraging our exports to them in a trade deficit. So if you look at this thing, this agreement, we see it both as a great deal in and of itself, but we also see it as the most sophisticated, cutting-edge template for future agreements. And by the way, I buried the lead here. It is the largest at $1.2 trillion. It's the largest trade deal the U.S. has ever entered into. And the fact that it's a good deal for America means that big is good here.
All right, big is good. Two final questions, because I know you got to get to a meeting, Peter Navarro, and take off. We're with Peter Navarro, Senior Economic Policy Advisor to the President and Assistant to the President for Trade and manufacturing in the White House. So the 300% tariff that the Canadians had on getting our dairy products in, what has become of that? Is that gone? Is that down to a reasonable amount?
So the big deal of the whole scope of this is there's these things called Class 6 and Class 7 dairy products that were harming people, particularly in Wisconsin, and those are gone. They're reformed in a way which will take some of that off the table. You know, the Canadians still are going to have some protections for their dairy products. It's the political reality of agriculture interests across the world. But it's much better, and we got a big win on that, and that's all to the good. And, I think that bottom line is we got a deal good for workers, good for Main Street, good for Wall Street, good for farmers, good for ranchers, good for innovators in Silicon Valley and elsewhere. And I think what's going to happen now is we'll see the presidents of Mexico and the U.S. coupled with the Prime Minister of Canada sign this on November 30th, probably down in Argentina at the G20 meeting, because that's where they'll be. That's the deadline. And then over some months, Congress will do their process under the Fast Track Authority. And at some point, this will come to the floor for a vote. And our expectation, because this deal is not a Democratic or Republican deal, but an American deal, we'll see broad bipartisan support.
I think you will also. Look, Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer the other day, who was not in favor of NAFTA when it came out, praised the deal. It means better access for U.S. dairy farmers to sell their products. It means more jobs and manufacturing for America. And just the final thing, and you got to take off, and that's wood. The Canadians have been dumping timber into the U.S. And one story I would always say, you would go through factories in Rust Belt, and the factories would be closed, and there would be plywood on the windows, and the plywood would say "Made in Canada," which would add insult to injury. How is that addressed?
Yeah, wow. Yeah, and I don't know if you mentioned the Death by China movie earlier. There's a heartbreaking vignette in that movie about how the factories get closed, and then the machinery in the factories get basically put in boxes and shipped off to China. So, ironies abound. But the lumber issue, the Department of Commerce has some pretty tough authorities under the anti-dumping, countervailing duties rules and other rules, and the USTR has some things, and we're very aggressive about cracking down on that. So that'll be a time for another discussion at a later date when I can give you some more details on that. But let's celebrate what we got this week, and this is a president which, in my judgment, is putting together the best performance of any president in history on the economy and trade in his first 20 months, and I hope people will give him his due on this, because it's a joy to watch.
Peter, it's an honor to have you on. Thank you for your time. Thank you for being with us. Peter Navarro, Assistant to the President for Trade and Manufacturing in the West Wing, and also a Senior Economic Policy Advisor. Peter, thanks for being with us. Great job.
All right, my friend. Bye-bye.